I've laid out a selection of nuts and bolts in front of us here. Let me just go over them basically. So this is what you call a cap screw. It's a cap screw because it's got what's known as an Allen-headed cap on it, and it's a screw because the thread goes all the way up the shank. That's a screw. That's a hex-headed screw. That is a bolt because it has a bare shank. They come in different sizes. All of these are metric. They're measured across the larger diameter there. So you may not be able to see, but this is a 6mm. So that's an M6 metric 6. This, a 12? No, an M10. Metric 10. And they come in a variety of different materials. These two are both stainless. This one is marked on the head what type of stainless it is. Don't know if you can see, that's an A270. The other common grade of stainless is an A480. A270 I think is 304L. A480 I think is 316. Different grades of stainless. The A4 is much tougher. It's an austenitic stainless steel, so it's much stronger than an A270. An A270 is roughly equivalent to your normal, what you might call a normal bolt, a normal high tensile bolt, which is what this is. This is the most common form of bolt. So it is 8.8 grade, and it is bright zinc plated. This will rust eventually, but it's pretty good to begin with. The 8.8 refers to the fact that it's 800 MPa, and it yields 80% of that, which is 640 MPa. This is in black condition, and it's been hanging around for a bit, so it's got a little bit of surface rust on it. And this, you probably can't see, but this is a 12.9, which means it yields, its ultimate is 1200 MPa, so half again as strong as that, and it yields at 90% of that. So it yields at over 1000. So that bolt is twice as strong as that bolt. So despite being smaller, that one will take an awful lot more load than that one. You do have to be careful with 12.9s though. Obviously, they're a little bit exotic. They don't like heat cycling. They don't like corrosion. They're very prone to hydrogen embrittlement. You've got to be very, very careful where you use them. Now, bolts are fascinating because when they're installed properly, they're impervious from the load they're on. What breaks things is cycling. What breaks things, if I got a paperclip, bend, it's called stress cycling, and eventually it'll crack. The same thing will happen with a bolt. If a bolt is fitted, and if it's subject to stretch very quickly, that will start to develop cracks and will fail. However, when it's installed properly, let me get a slightly bigger bolt for this demonstration. All right. When it is installed properly, you can imagine when I tension that down, what's going to happen is this bolt is actually going to stretch very slightly. And also, the part it's fitting into is going to deform, it's going to squash very slightly. So long as the stress that the bolt is under doesn't go beyond that, the preload which is set into that bolt will not experience any stress whatsoever. Because what happens is when you pull on that, the bolt doesn't stretch. All that happens is that relaxes slightly. Fascinating stuff. That's why it's so important to fit bolts to the specified torque. Specified torque means that you are putting the correct load into the bolt. By tensioning that, by tightening that, you're determining how much stretch there is on that. It's actually more accurate to tighten it up until it's seated and then tighten the required number of turns. You'll often see this in cylinder head bolts. A lot of what I've been talking about is illustrated in cylinder head bolts. They're very long, so they stretch by quite a bit. And they're obviously subject to an awful lot. Every time the engine fires, they're subject to a stress cycle. So it's very important to tighten them correctly. Now, there's one thing which, my little tray of nuts and bolts is full of. And that's these things. These are what are called spring washers. You can see it's got a little split in there. The idea is that once the bolt's tightened down, and there's no way I'm going to be able to move that. That compresses and I'll add some spring into the bolt. But as I've just explained, if a bolt is tightened properly, the whole bolt works like a spring. The whole bolt is stretched. These are pointless. Absolutely useless. I pulled out a couple of nuts as well, just to show you. Again, these have got the material marked on them. Two different types. This one is just a double chamfer nut. You can see it's chamfered on both sides. You get ones which are flanged, which have got a wider face on one side, which means you can do without a washer. But in this case, you would use this nut with a washer just to spread the load over a larger area. And then you get nylox. Nylox just got a little bit of plastic in there, which will grip the thread. It means if the bolt comes loose, that's not going to rattle off and the bolt will still stay in place. Bolts should never be used in shear, however. So although you can use a bolt to pin two things together, you never want the bolt to be loose like that so they can rattle around. That'll very quickly wear the bolt out and very quickly lead to failure. In a situation like that, what you're doing is you're tensioning it together, so there's so much friction between the two faces that will overcome, that the friction force between the two faces overcomes any load which is pulling them apart. So the bolt is simply acting as a direct load. These are some of the most remarkable bolts which I've ever worked with, which I designed actually. This was for a very high stress cycling connection. So these bolts, which were holding the whole damn thing together, had to be absolutely isolated from the loads that were going on. These, I don't know if you can see the glove which is just sitting on one of them. These are M64 bolts, M64 by about 1.5 meters long, and when they were fully tensioned, they produced 160 tons each. Now, although you do get a spanner which will fit an M64 nut, there's no way you were going to be able to deliver that kind of load by hand. So these were tensioned using a hydraulic tensioner, which would stretch the bolt and compress the tube by a total of about 5 millimeters. Now the most remarkable thing was you'd do this by hand. You'd have a little hand pump on this hydraulic thing. You'd pump away and stretch it back, and when it was fully stretched, you'd then spin the nut up the 5 millimeters and then relax everything. This was in a fairly small enclosed space, and the thought of what it would be like if one of those rods failed and a nut and stud end came off at ballistic speeds bouncing around inside of there. Yeah, I didn't think too much about that. I find them fascinating. I hope that was interesting. Right, I'm going to get on with sorting out the bike. I've got more bits to take off.